topic if you see आपके GS3 paper में is inclusive growth, inclusive growth, inclusive growth. So what is inclusive growth? So whenever we are studying about inclusive growth, you should understand कि inclusive growth क्या है and why it is important. Why UPSC wants you to study inclusive growth? So सबसे important है, can anyone tell me, or what we'll do is ठीक है, what we'll do is we'll think for a minute. So take a 1 minute and think what is inclusive growth, whatever comes to your mind. I'm not giving you a hint कि inclusive growth क्या है, irrespective आपको आता है नहीं आता है. What you need to do is you have to think what is inclusive growth and why it is important. Why it is important? Think for a minute. Think for a minute. ठीक है, think for a minute. ठीक है. No, do not write. Take a blank paper and think what is inclusive growth. You have to ask yourself. जब तक आप पूछोगे नहीं, your conceptual clarity would not happen. Secondly, already you must be knowing certain important things, but जब तक आप ब्रेन पर प्रेशर नहीं डालोगे टू रिट्राइव इट, इट वुड नॉट हैपन. अगर आपको नहीं भी पता है, लॉजिक से आ रहा है क्या चीजें, क्योंकि 10 क्वेश्चंस डायरेक्टली ऑन द स्पॉट आपको बनाने हैं यूपीएससी. अगर नहीं भी आ रहा है तो कैन यू लॉजिकली थिंक यार इंक्लूसिव ग्रोथ क्या है. ठीक है, ठीक है, ठीक है. नो वन वुड राइट. थिंक, राइट ऑन अ पेपर. जब तक आप लिखना स्टार्ट नहीं करोगे पेपर पर, things would not come out. Things would not come out of your brain. ठीक, ठीक है. So coming back to what is inclusive growth. So जब भी आप कोई टॉपिक ले रहे हो तो आपको डेफिनेशन, you should be very crystal clear with definition. Inclusive growth according to UNDP, inclusive growth is a process and outcome. It is a process and outcome where all groups of a society, all groups or all members of the society or organization have participated in the growth process and have benefited from the growth process. So it is a process and outcome where everyone is taking part in the economic growth process and everyone is getting benefited out of the economic process. Everyone, even the last, who is standing last in the line, who is the most vulnerable, who is the most vulnerable section, he is getting benefited out of the economic growth process. He is getting benefited out of the growth process. This is the ultimate definition. So whenever you write about inclusive growth, you have to focus on these two processes where the benefit reaches everyone and everyone participates in the economic growth process. Imagine a country where you have top business class from Mumbai whose income is rising day by day. And on the other side, what we see is in the global hunger index, the malnutrition in India is still rising. Would you call this a growth process as a inclusive growth? Or what would be the use of such growth process? Where you have billionaires rising, where your country is, your GDP is rising, but your poorest people are suffering. There's hunger, there's malnutrition, there's 50% of your women are facing anemia. Is there any use of such growth? So ultimately, what inclusive growth is, it demands that every section of the society benefits and every section of society participates in the process. So that is inclusive growth. We just do not watch. हमारा aim growth नहीं है. हमारा aim growth नहीं है. Growth नहीं. हमारा aim क्या है? Inclusive growth. So how did this process of inclusive growth happen? Is initially what we thought is economic growth is important. Economic growth is important. Economic growth. So we thought economic growth would happen and slowly क्या होगा? Everything would fall in a line. But now our concept has changed to what we need is inclusive growth. Here what happens is everyone is getting benefited. Everyone is getting benefited in the process. That is inclusive growth. And ठीक है, इतना समझ आया. Secondly, if you see any government, what is the ultimate aim of any government? Ultimate aim क्या है? इसका aim क्या है? If you can ask yourself, ultimate aim of any government is social development, welfare of all, and third and most important is protection of vulnerable section. Protection of vulnerable section. Protection of vulnerable. And how this would happen? This would happen through the mean to achieve this ultimate aim is inclusive growth. Once you will have growth process which benefits all, ultimately there would be social development, there will be welfare of all, and there will be protection of all. So this is ultimately what is inclusive growth. And the concept of inclusive growth can also be linked to GS paper 4. GS paper 4 से कैसे link कर सकते हैं? If you know the concept of Sarvodaya of Gandhiji. Sir, Gandhiji says the government or a country should focus on the process, focus on the values of Sarvodaya, that is welfare of all. That is welfare of all. That is welfare of all. ठीक है? That is welfare of all. That is welfare of all. So that is the main aim of inclusive. So you have understood the concept कि inclusive growth क्यों चाहिए? Why do we need inclusive growth in a crux format? That is, it is a means to achieve an end. End क्या है? Social development, welfare and ठीक है? ठीक है? So this is how you need to do. And secondly, if you have to use any quote, अगर inclusive growth should not be used only from GS3 perspective, it has to be used from essay perspective में definitely you have to write inclusive growth. आपको narrow perspective से नहीं देखना है. If you see Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, what he said, he said the ambition of greatest men of this generation is to wipe every tear from every eye. Every tear from every eye. That is the quote you have to write during whenever you are writing about inclusive growth. If you conclude with this line, definitely you will get a mark. If you write this in essay, definitely you will get a. How do you deal with poverty is through inclusive growth. How do you deal with poverty is through inclusive growth. ठीक है? That is सबका साथ and सबका विकास. So right, very rightly said by someone, सबका साथ and सबका विकास. See, सबका साथ and सबका विकास. सबका विकास. अब सबका साथ is everyone is involved and सबका विकास. सबका विकास. So here what you need to understand here, who is all of us? Benefiting all. So as I told you, it is not just the benefit should not reach, the benefit should reach everyone and everyone should be part. Who is everyone? Everyone is not just present generation, but also future generation. Future generation. The benefits of economic growth should reach future generation. So if we have a economic growth which is based on spending, which is based on high fiscal deficit, our future generation would be affected. If we have economic growth which is based on excessive thermal power use, which would pollute our environment, which would lead to climate change, would that be an inclusive growth? No, it would not be inclusive growth. So our focus should not be just on intra-generational inclusive growth, but intergenerational inclusive growth, where the future generation is also taken care. The future generation is also taken care into. Okay? So the concept of inclusive growth or the concept of development has evolved. First, the concept was economic growth. Then we focused on inclusive growth and inclusive development. And now the concept has changed to sustainable development. Sustainable. So this diagram you have to understand. This diagram you have to understand. So how do we move from inclusive economic growth to inclusive growth is through process. First is through equity measures, promoting equity. And second is by promoting social security. Social security. Once you are having inclusive growth, then you need to focus on environment conservation. Environment conservation. Then you will reach a concept of sustainable. So our focus has to change from economic growth to sustainable development, and the mid path is inclusive growth or inclusive development. Inclusive growth or inclusive development. So this is an important concept which you should know. Next is our growth story. So whenever there is a question with respect to inclusive growth, you should have certain facts ready. Is our growth inclusive? You might say that India is the 5th largest economy. Recently, there was a data that India's economy is growing between 6% GDP. But does it define inclusive growth? No. So if you see inclusive growth, you should know data. Certain Oxfam report says, हमेशा जब भी report कोई data put in करो, you should have a data. Oxfam report says that 1% of Indians own, the top 1% own close to 40% of wealth. 40% of wealth. We have hunger index, global hunger index. What is the rank of India in global hunger index? 107. Our malnutrition, underweight. How many people are underweight? Close to 32% children are underweight. 50% of are anemic. Our labor force participation, female labor force participation, close to 30%. 30%. Is are women a part of our economic growth story? Is are women part of economic? No. Our human development index kitna hai? 131. We focus on. So this fact you should write, and you should know ki though we have made progress on the economic front, but we are still lagging with respect to ensuring inclusive growth. We are working towards this. Our multidimensional poverty index report says we have reduced poverty from 51% to 16% in last close to 20 years. We have reduced it. We are on the path of ensuring inclusive growth, but we have not reached it. We have not reached it. Okay? So this is what you should know. Our unemployment rate is close to 8% according to Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. Unemployment. So if the youth are not part of the economic process, would we call that growth as economic growth? No. See, ठीक है, ये सबसे important है, ये important चीज है. Now you think next important is reasons. You tell me what are the reasons for this non-inclusive growth? क्या reasons है? Think for 3 minutes. Everyone is going to think for 3 minutes. ठीक है? What are the reasons for non-inclusive growth? What are the reasons? ठीक है? Everyone. 3 minutes. Let's try to, and this is a simple topic which you should know. So the first concept we deal was definition of inclusive growth. What is the concept? How economic growth, inclusive development, and sustainable development are linked. Next is what are the reasons? What are the barriers? Reasons is other. What are the barriers to inclusive growth? What are the barriers India is facing with respect to inclusive growth? What are the barriers in achieving this inclusive growth? So as we discussed, first what we discussed was, I'll put it in the right frame. Inclusive growth का definition देखा हमने कुछ data देखा, हमने एक diagram देखा with respect to inclusion. Now we are looking into barriers of inclusive growth. So barriers, the first and most important barrier what I found is there was a policy failure. Sir, you'll ask me, sir, what is this policy failure? And this has been happening throughout last 60-70 years. So initially what we thought was, if there is an economic growth, slowly it will trickle down. So first we focus on trickle down theory. We focus on Kuznets curve. Kuznets curve, what did it say? Initially there would be inequality, rising inequality, slowly inequality would decrease. Then what we realize are this inequality is not decreasing, and Kuznets curve was rejected by everyone. So we cannot only depend on economic growth, and there cannot be we cannot just believe on invisible hand. So this was rejected. Then came the approach. What we'll give is basic need approach. What government would do is we'll give them basic needs: roti, kapda, makan. So we thought what we'll do is we'll give them basic food, bare minimum things in the form of PDS. Okay? Third came right-based approach. This was unsustainable. Basic need was unsustainable because was it solving the problem permanently? It was looking only at the syndromic approach, not at the positive level. It was not dealing with the cause. Syndrome सिर्फ क्या है? लोग गरीब है तो क्या करो? पैसा दे दो, खाना दे दो, कपड़ा दे दो, मकान दे दो. But is it a solution? No, you are just treating the symptoms. What you need to do is then government realizes इससे क्या हो रहा है? Fiscal deficit बढ़ रहा है. Fiscal deficit बढ़ रहा है. सेकेंडली उसके बाद भी हमने क्या बोला, हम ठीक है हम क्या करेंगे, राइट बेस्ड अप्रोच देंगे. राइट बेस्ड अप्रोच में क्या हुआ, इफ यू रिमेंबर नेशनल फूड सिक्योरिटी एक्ट, दैट इज प्रोवाइडिंग फूड, दैट वाज गिवन एज अ राइट टू एजुकेशन, दैट वाज गिवन एज अ राइट टू हेल्थ, दैट वाज गिवन एज अ राइट. See, then we move to right based approach, and slowly government realize यार ये कुछ नहीं काम करेगा. Ultimately, if you have to ensure inclusive growth, if you have to have development, what we require is capacity based approach, capability based approach, which Amartya Sen brought out, where he told we need to improve the skills. So you remember a famous Chinese proverb: if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach him how to fish, you feed him for an entire life. Then we realize that if you see, all the government measures are towards skill development. We have a new ministry in the form of skill development. What we have is Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Yojana. We are looking at vocational training, vocational education. So first problem was there was a policy failure. Second problem, did you understand the concept of policy failure, how our policies failed? And this concept of trickle down right based approach can be used, essay में भी use हो सकता है, ethics में भी use हो सकता है, GS2 में भी use हो सकता है. So the concept what we are trying to do is we are trying to do that. And यही हम संकल्प मेंस बैच में करने वाले. We are going to focus on ऐसे points हम आपको बताएंगे जो you can use it and your brain would get those points. ठीक है. Next important was resource crunch. We were not developed. Our wealth there was plundering of wealth by Britishers. Post independent, we were very weak country. So there was resource crunch also. Third was population explosion also led to this problem because we had to deal with such a large population. Next was, you can write about corruption. Rajiv Gandhi told almost 80% of if government was spending 1 rupee, almost 60 to 80 paise was not reaching the intended beneficiaries. There was infrastructure deficit, the problem of infrastructure deficit. Okay? The सबसे important problem was with respect to हमारा agriculture sector. What we did was we moved from agriculture directly to service sector. What we skipped was a manufacturing era, which is an important point for providing employment, for providing jobs, and for ensuring for development of weaker section. And our agriculture sector is also underdeveloped. So 70% of our population lives in rural area. And for rural area, the entire rural economy is based on agriculture. And our agriculture has not performed well in the last 60 years, our growth rate has been less than 4% in agriculture. Until there is growth, until there is improvement in agriculture, we would not have, every policy would fail. 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 Next is social discrimination based on caste, gender, patriarchal mindset is also reason for, or are also barriers to inclusive growth. Women are not allowed to go out of the society, go out of their homes. So patriarchy, caste-based discrimination are also important barriers to inclusive growth. Important barriers to inclusive growth. Gender inequality are also barriers. ठीक है, ये सबसे important है. And so next important thing what you need to look into is, ठीक है, you understood और भी important points है, we look into it, but core point समझ आ गया कि barriers क्या है, why we are not having a growth story. First is policy failure, execution. What we had is governance issues. Though policies were made, it was not implemented. Why it was not implemented? Because there was corruption, there was leakages. Next is GS1 how can you link? There was, the agriculture sector did not improve. We moved directly from agriculture sector to service sector. Caste-based discrimination, gender-based discrimination, patriarchy. ये कुछ important reasons हैं. ठीक है? So this is how you need to think over points. Next is, what would happen if there is non-inclusive growth? Think for 2 minutes. Non-inclusive growth होगा तो क्या होगा? Non-inclusive growth होगा तो क्या होगा? 2 minutes. Everyone write on the paper. I want everyone to be part. चलेगा? Why? See, very good. Whenever there is non-inclusive growth, what would happen is, first important, regionalism, rise of regionalism. One area is, one part of the country is developing, other part is not developing. What would happen is rise of regionalism. ठीक है? Demand for reservation, definitely demand for reservation. Why demand for reservation is rising? Because the growth is not percolating to every section of the society, and everyone wants reservation. The demand for reservation rise. Third is GS3 से कैसे रख सकते हो? Naxalism. The rise of Naxalism is because of uneven distribution of development and growth. ठीक है, ठीक है, ठीक है, ठीक है, ठीक है. Pollution. How does non-inclusive growth leads to pollution? Pollution. How does it lead to pollution? How does it lead to pollution? As Indira Gandhi said, poverty is the biggest polluter. So if you are poor, what you will do is you will use wood. What you will do is you will defecate in open. There would not be basic necessities. So definitely there would be pollution. You would use all the unsustainable measures for energies. Coal हो गया, wood हो गया, ठीक है, important है. Rise of crimes, definitely in a society, number one reason for rise of crimes in society is non-inclusive growth. Youths are not finding sources for employment. ठीक है, ठीक है, ठीक है. That is the impact. ठीक है, ठीक है. Communalism, definitely. Communalism. Politicians use this inequality for their private benefit. By raging or by ensuring that two communities fight based on resources. ठीक है, ठीक है. Definitely, when there is non-inclusive growth, it would lead to rise of poverty, it would lead to rise of unemployment. ठीक है, ये तो होगा ही, होगा. Definitely. Our fiscal deficit would increase. Fiscal deficit would definitely increase. Definitely increase. ठीक है. So if a democratic country is not able to provide basic services, will our trust on democracy would decrease? Definitely. People would not go to vote. ठीक है, people would not go to vote. तो ये सबसे important है. So what would be the impact? This would be the impact. This would be the major impact. ठीक है, ठीक है. तो ये important है. Next is you should also know certain basic components or features of inclusive growth. लिख के लो, features of inclusive. What are the basic features? How is a society which has, what is the component if you want to ensure inclusive growth, what you need to focus on? Which all the components you need to focus on? ठीक है, ठीक है. Which components? First is you need to focus on employment generation. These are the features. If you want inclusive growth, you need to focus on employment generation. Second is you need to focus on skill development. You need to focus on social protection. You need to focus on financial inclusion. You need to focus on gender equality. You need to focus on infrastructure development. ठीक है, and ultimately sustainable development. ठीक है. FDI would also decrease अगर हमारा growth ही नहीं है, if we have so much crimes. ठीक है. So these are the features. If you want inclusive growth, you need to focus on these features. Your growth process should be based on these features. That is, it should be focused on employment generation. It should focus on skill development. It should focus on social protection. Our 85% of our employment जो होती है, it is in informal sector. 85% informal sector में they do not have social protection. we cannot have inclusive growth until we convert our non-formal economy or informal economy, informal economy into a formal economy. We need to shift to formal economy. Then only with that they would get social protection and they would be protected under laws. ठीक है, तो ये सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट है, तो ये सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट पार्ट है, एंड इफ यू सी तो ये सब कंपोनेंट्स है. What measures government are taking? What measures? So first and most importantly, so you can write everything under inclusive growth. If you can write everything under inclusive growth, सब कुछ लिख सकते हो. But if you can write it in a structural format, definitely. So what government is doing on economic front में क्या कर रही है? They are focusing on financial inclusion. कैसे? प्रधानमंत्री जन धन योजना. Government is focusing on MSME. MSME would lead to employment generation. Government is focusing on SHGs. So economic front में what we are doing is we are focusing on ensuring entrepreneurship. We are focusing on sectors which are employment generation sectors. ठीक है, economic. Social front पे what we are doing to promote inclusive growth, we are focusing on education, we are focusing on health, we are focusing on skill development. ठीक है, skill development. ठीक है, skill development. And administratively or politically what we are doing is we are focusing on decentralization of power, we are focusing on transparency, we are focusing on e-governance, which would lead to efficient implementation of the schemes. We are trying to move economy में you can write, we are trying to move from informal economy to formal economy. सारे measures लिख सकते हो, सारे measures लिख सकते हो. इंक्लूसिव, जब भी हम इंक्लूसिव ग्रोथ या इंक्लूसिव डेवलपमेंट की बात करते हैं, यू कैन ऑल्सो राइट व्हाई, मतलब इफ यू सी political participation of women is very less, close to 14%, which is very less. We need to bring all the women's in political participation बढ़ाना पड़ेगा. Sustainable development, if you see environment का भी part सीख सकते हो. Government is also not focusing on present generation but also future generation. We are focusing on ensuring controlling pollution, ensuring we have our Panchamitra, or what do you say, 5 goals with respect to climate change that will be carbon neutral by 2070. Will focus on carbon sequestration. So all the 5 goals which India agreed to achieve with respect to climate change. We are also focusing on protection of biodiversity. We have FRBM Act, यहाँ भी लिख सकते हो FRBM Act. हम we do not want to ensure हमारा budgetary deficit इतना बढ़े. ठीक है, ठीक, पंचमित्र, ठीक, यस, पंचमित्र, ठीक है. नीति आयोग also has said there has to be, नीति आयोग को आप लिख सकते हो. नीति आयोग has said, how do we ensure inclusive growth or inclusive development? They have said, first what we need to do is we have to have rapid economic growth. Rapid economic growth है, चाहिए, ठीक है. We need to leverage technology for sustainable development. ठीक है. We need to focus on skill development. We need to focus on skill development. ठीक है, ये कुछ इंपॉर्टेंट चीज है नीति आयोग ने बोली थी। वन मोर इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग आई वुड लाइक टू टेल यू, एक कॉन्सेप्ट बताना चाहता हूं। एज प्रीवियस पार्ट में जैसे हमारा ये कर्व था, कौन सा कर्व था? कुजनेट्स कर्व, which said कि inequality would decrease with time, but Thomas Piketty in his recent, मतलब few years back, he brought out an important book, Capital in 21st Century. He said that until government makes active intervention, we cannot remove inequalities. Government has to actively intervene. ऐसे नहीं हो सकता कि automatically inequality कम होगी. So he said, if you want to move from economic growth to development or inclusive growth, what we need is government intervention. Government intervention in the form of social security benefits, government interventions in the form of skill development, government intervention in the form of progressive taxation, progressive taxation, progressive taxation, progressive taxation, progressive taxation. ठीक है? And so there was a question in UPSC, can a market-based economy be focused on inclusive growth? Definitely. This can happen through government intervention. Government intervention. Market-based economy, if there is intervention by government. Intervention कैसे? Social security के interventions, taxation के interventions, skill development के interventions, social development के interventions. Definitely we would, the market economy can also focus on this, focus on this, focus on this. ठीक है, ठीक है, ठीक है. Market economy on its own cannot do this, but it has to be done through active intervention, active intervention. ठीक है. And what is the benefit once we have inclusive growth? Society, imagine we have inclusive growth, everyone is growing, everyone has all the resources, all the basic necessities. So what would happen? There would be social stability. Social stability. Social stability, right? Society, once there is social stability, there would be decisions which are taken in consonance. Decisions would be more, मतलब everyone can come to a point very easily. ठीक है, इंक्लूसिव डिसीजन मेकिंग होगी, इंक्लूसिव डिसीजन मेकिंग होगी, इंप्लीमेंटेशन आसानी से होगा, आसानी से होगा, आसानी से होगा, आसानी से होगा. ठीक है. So what we learned through today's session was, with respect to inclusive. And conclusion में जब भी inclusive growth का conclusion लिखना है, ठीक है, what you will write is, inclusive growth is an important tool to achieve what? Sustainable and equitable society. Equitable society. Sustainable and equitable societies. And this can be done through, कैसे करेंगे? By addressing inequalities, empowering marginalized groups, empowering marginalized group, and addressing inequalities, inequalities.